And that's Cohen Eaton, who's the father of the little girl who died in Johannesburg last week. Well, Mmusi Maimane believes there is a case to prove that the state has been negligent. He joins me now. Mr. Maimane, such a tragic story. It's heartbreaking. But in what way do you believe the state has been specifically negligent? And it's focusing on this case. How are you going to win this case, essentially?
Well, Sally, first and foremost, I spoke to the father earlier on today, and like a father of a 3-year-old myself, there's nothing greater tragedy than what's occurred. In reality, the provision of electricity is the guarantor for constitutional rights, the right to life. It was the basis of the case we took to the High Court, where ultimately the state was compelled to provide alternative energy at healthcare facilities, hospitals, and police stations. Instead of just complying with that order, which today, God knows what would have happened if that child was able to get to a healthcare facility that at least had an alternative energy. We wouldn't today be having this conversation, but instead, the government has chosen not only to oppose that order, but to ultimately, as we saw in this particular case, will continue to believe that load shedding is the only way out. And therefore, I believe culpable homicide is a function of negligence on the part of the state. They have failed on all accounts, not only to communicate accurately, to maintain infrastructure, but this belief that ultimately load shedding is the only alternative out, to me, means the state is now acting against its own citizens.
Of course, it's going to have to come down to the law and precedent, and I would imagine it's fairly unprecedented. We're used to the state being sued when it comes to a death in hospital, for example. But is there any precedent in South African law for a case like this? Because we're looking at a broad issue that's had specific consequences. You mentioned the court order that you received. Does that pave the way for this in any way, or are you going to be having to set precedents through this case?
It's both and. We believe ultimately the court order compels the state to have acted in that way. And in fact, even the response by Eskom or City Power in this response is callous in that manner. It simply just makes the case to say that we're not responsible for what happens. And I'm going, no, that is woefully unacceptable. How many citizens have to die if we're going to continue in this manner where we just simply believe load shedding is that? So the court case that we won in the North Gauteng High Court does pave the way to say the state has a responsibility to provide alternates for citizens. And ultimately, their argument is a poor one that says that should they be able to do that and exempt certain clients off the grid, they would end up in a state of grid collapse, which would present conditions such as those in Venezuela, etc. And I make the basic case, no. Citizens are already living in conditions like Venezuela, such as this family. They can't access healthcare. And then lastly, I do think a responsible local government, like a nation like Poland that went through similar conditions, we should have by now been given solar to particularly vulnerable citizens so that they can have alternate energy available to them. Yeah. If indeed this government has to be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable, I would argue that this government is now failing at its most costly and deathly sense.
Right. Is it not quite different? I'm thinking of previous examples. A situation in a hospital where a doctor, for example, is accused of negligence in behaviour and treatment of a specific individual, because the reality is that this was not a threat only to this poor little girl, or it wasn't a circumstance only to this poor little girl. You could argue, perhaps, that everyone is aware of the risks of load shedding, ongoing power cuts, that power cuts are planned and unexpected, which Eskom says all the time. I'm wondering how you'd be able to argue in that sort of situation, where everyone knows about the lack of reliability, that it's still the state's problem. I'm worried that it might end up in a situation where the finger of blame is pointed at the family in an attempt by the state to absolve themselves.
Well, we're a constitutional democracy, and our legal counsel will give us guidance in this regard. We have to answer the question about rights. And the right to health and life are guaranteed in our constitution. And therefore, in this instance, what alternative remedy could this individual who in this instance was in a vulnerable position have? It is the same in some ways, maybe to draw a scenario. All the people who died of cholera in Hammanskraal effectively had water that the Human Rights Commission a number of years ago had already made the point to say that that water is not fit for human consumption. Yet no action was taken and citizens have died. It is no different, particularly, and it happens in communities such as that. So to me, there's no doubt that there's a tangential link to what load shedding is doing to the right to life of particular citizens. And in fact, when the president made his argument in our court case, he said, no, he's under no constitutional obligation to provide electricity. Well, if it doesn't specifically say that, it demonstrates the fact that ultimately, if he can't provide electricity, he's then incapable of meeting the constitutional obligations. And that's what the basis of our case is, and that's what will be one of the lead arguments we'll put forward in this particular case.
Yeah, you mentioned the Hammanskraal situation. I mean, that was going to be my next question, is if you're going to be saying the government's failed and is, that they are, in your view, guilty of negligence and they could be charged for culpable homicide, with over 20 deaths in Hammanskraal. I've just spoken to the DG of Water, and he says they haven't as yet picked up cholera in the tap water, but it's full of E. coli. He said it's clear that the entire system is absolutely unsafe and unsanitary, even though they haven't specifically picked up cholera. Clear acknowledgement that that sanitation system has completely failed. Are you considering opening cases around the Hammanskraal cholera deaths?
What we have to do now is we are with our team in Gauteng as Build One South Africa, have asked them to follow up on that human rights complaint that was laid. Because if the human rights has already made a ruling on a particular matter, then ultimately, if the state fails to remedy that, they not only are in contempt of court, it is clear and obvious a serious case of culpable homicide, given those two variables. So we'll certainly be taking up those actions, and the team in Gauteng is taking forward. And Sally, in truth, and this is what is devastating for citizens, is that for many of the people in this country feel like there are no alternatives. There's simply no other way or other remedy solutions put before them. And yet they're available there. We've already put before the state that there can be a build, own and operate model where people who've got excess energy can sell it to the government. We should be more aggressive with that. We should be putting solar on people's rooftops so that we can augment load shedding and reduce demand. And in this water instance, we demand accountability for those who are responsible over the years for not complying with the Human Rights Commission order. We cannot be sitting here day in, day out, noticing tragedy after tragedy and failing to recognize who is responsible for this. And I think ultimately the ANC and the government must be held liable for the culpability of the killing, of the death of so many of our citizens in our country.
I think accountability is so crucial, particularly when so many people have been failed. The reality is, though, to fix many of these problems, it's going to mean all hands on deck. The community is going to have to be involved. Politicians, especially in coalition governments, are going to have to work together. And if they don't, and they revert to polarised politicking in the build-up to this election, even less is going to get done. At this time, what kind of leadership are we needing? Are we needing pointing fingers and accountability, or are we needing leaders to come forward and say, we've got to make this happen? I mean, what we're seeing in Swan is we're seeing a DA mayor speaking very openly to an ANC minister about the water problems, agreeing to work together. Isn't that the sort of thing we should be pushing more of as well?
We need more of it. And it's one of the reasons when, as I tabled that 10-point plan, I said, stop the bickering, stop the bickering in municipality. Let's bring everybody together. Here's a plan that we can all agree on issues that make life for all citizens possible, on energy, on education, on safety, on water, and many others, to say, Let's coalesce around these things and focus on delivering for people. But it's not only just even a question of what the state can do here. I've already reached out to private sector citizens to say to them, where there are poor and vulnerable citizens, let us be at the forefront of providing inverters or providing solar. Alternative energy can't be a function of just who's got money and who doesn't. We can do better here. And so ultimately, this moment, this crisis requires all of us to work together, but not to the absolution of the current government in place. Because if we do that, it's the same as the pothole dilemma that we see in many cities. People step in, they fix the potholes, and it's almost as if the government is doing its job. Citizens must be able to do both, hold the state accountable, but furthermore, collaborate together with the type of leadership that says, here's the future of this country and how we can take it forward. And I'm committed to that process. I'm engaging all political parties, actors, the private sector to make sure that they are part of it, so that ultimately as a country, we don't have a spare South Africa. Neither can we afford to lose more lives. So we ultimately must act together in this instance and show the sort of resolve that the people of this country are made of.
Yeah, we don't have a spare South Africa. You are quite right there. Thank you so much for speaking to us. That, of course, is the leader of Build One SA, Mmusi Maimane, and they have laid a culpable homicide charge against the state over the death of this little girl who died when her oxygen and inverter system failed due to unplanned outages. Now let's move to